Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Douglas Small and welcome to the final speaker event in our EHU19 virtual speaker series for 2022. After you've watched this talk, please don't forget to join us for the live Q&A, which has now been rescheduled for Thursday the 5th of May at 6 p.m. UK time. You'll receive a Zoom link to join and we look forward to seeing you there. As ever, you can follow us on Twitter at EHU19 or get updates via our website. But for now, I'm delighted to welcome tonight's speaker. Dr. Clare Clarke is an assistant professor in English at Trinity College Dublin, and her research focuses on Victorian popular fiction, particularly crime and detective fiction. She's the author of late Victorian crime fiction In the Shadows of Sherlock, and British detective fiction 1891 to 1901, the successors to Sherlock Holmes, which was published in 2020. She's currently working on two new projects, which I'm sure you could ask her about in the Q&A if you like. One is a project mapping space and place in the Sherlock Holmes stories, and the second is a critical biography of real-life private detective agency operating in Victorian London. But for now, she's here to talk to us about A Shrine of Pilgrimage, Dark Tourism in Late Victorian Newspapers, Ripper Reportage. Thank you very much.
Hi everybody, I'm Clare Clarke. Thanks so much for joining me tonight for my talk, A Shrine of Pilgrimage, Dark Tourism in Late Victorian Newspapers, Ripper Reportage. And thank you so much to the staff at Edge Hill for inviting me to speak to you this evening. So we'll make a start here with the news story that you might have seen in and around 2020 about a mural by a female street artist called Zazu that popped up on the side of the Duke of Wellington pub in London's East End. You can see here it's an enormous, quite scary trompe-l'oeil image of a blood-stained bowler-hatted man leering down over the street. And it appeared in March 2020, just before the first COVID lockdown. And it's fair to say that it unsettled many of the local residents. The mural sprang up just a few meters away from a barber shop called Jack the Clipper, and not too much of a distance away from Jack the Chipper, the chip shop. I think I have pictures of those here to show you. So pre-COVID, there were constant Jack the Ripper tours around here, and obviously from the names of these establishments, you'll see that there is capital being made out of the Jack the Ripper phenomenon in this area. There's even a Jack the Ripper museum, of course, which opened in 2015 in spite of much local protest. In fact, when this Ripper Museum opened in 2015, it was initially touted as a museum about the social history of women in the East End. But in news that shocked virtually no one, it in fact opened as a museum devoted to Jack the Ripper and his victims, but mainly to Jack the Ripper, as the title of the museum indicates. On entering the museum, patrons were greeted by a soundtrack of women screaming. Ghoulish waxworks of the Ripper's dead victims sat in rooms with just a few pieces of A4 paper attached to the walls with information about their deaths. There is a mortuary section of the museum which includes photographs of the disemboweled women. Like all good museums, you exit through the gift shop, and there you can buy trinkets which are embellished with Jack the Ripper blood spatters. There are Jack the Ripper top hats and two varieties of Keep Calm t-shirts. Now, local residents, campaign groups, academics and feminist protesters have all joined forces to call for its closure ever since, claiming that this is a museum which very patently glamorises sexualised violence against women, and that although it espouses to be some kind of a feminist museum, it's in fact misogynistic and voyeuristic through and through. The museum stayed open for quite a while in spite of locals' distaste. As far as I know, the latest I have is that it is closed and that it's awaiting sale. Somebody may want to correct me there. They may have something even more up to date. But nonetheless, after the lockdowns were lifted, Jack the Ripper tours continued to take place as they had done before in the East End of London. But there was something about this Jack the Ripper mural that I showed you that seemed to not just unsettle but actively disgust local residents. As one resident put it, the artist, it seems to me, has danced on the graves of Eddowes, Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride and Mary Jane Kelly. Hallie Rubenhold, who I'm sure many of you will know as the author of The Five, an award-winning account of the lives of the women who died at the hands of the Ripper, says that it's time for people to stop cashing in on the murders. This mural, she says, is a celebration of a killer. It's a man who murdered women, who literally ripped them apart. And she says, we as a society, going back 132 years, have been fanning his flames, and a lot of people haven't thought about this. So in September 2020, a local writer climbed up and whitewashed over the mural and wrote the name of one of the Ripper's victims, Catherine Eddowes, on top. Speaking to The Guardian, he said, the mural seemed to be playing the Ripper for laughs. I contacted the artist and said, are you aware of the general feeling in the neighbourhood about Jack the Ripper and how the whole industry around him is so exploitative? But she wasn't. And it seems really surprising, I think, that a female artist especially simply didn't think about exalting a murderer of women. As Eliot puts it, it seems very strange to wash your hands and not have any opinion on a piece of art and its context. One Sunday afternoon, we popped up and painted over it. While we were there, I thought of putting up a name. We thought that that might help redress the balance. Now, these Ripper tours and murals and museums and chip shops and all the rest of it are examples of a phenomenon which has been known as dark tourism. What exactly is dark tourism then? Well, it was first described by Malcolm Foney and John Lennon as the presentation and consumption by visitors of real and commodified death and disaster sites. This definition was then expanded in 2013 by P.R. Stone, who says dark tourism is concerned with tourist encounters with spaces of death or calamity that have perturbed the public consciousness, whereby actual and recreated places of the deceased, horror, atrocity or depravity are consumed through visitor experiences. I could talk a little bit more about the distinction between what's called dark tourism and what's called thanatourism. I don't have time at the moment. That's something I could perhaps talk about in our question and answer section. But examples of dark touristic sites would be places where mass murders have occurred, where terrorist atrocities like the Twin Towers have been perpetrated, prisons where executions have taken place, even wax museums and other museums of crime. Growing up in Belfast, as I did, I'm well aware of dark tourism, that my home city has built an entire tourist industry around so-called troubles tours, which are often run by ex-paramilitaries who will drive you around various sites of atrocities in a black taxi. So I'm very well acquainted with this phenomenon. More recently, after the release of the HBO miniseries Chernobyl, there was a resurgence in Chernobyl dark tourism, which was conducted mainly by Instagram influencers, often pictured half naked in sites of still dangerous levels of radiation. And, on the back of this type of dark tourism for clicks and likes, organisations such as the Holocaust Museum have been keen to remind visitors about appropriate behaviour really at these sites. They tweeted in March 2019 that the train tracks leading to Auschwitz should not be viewed as a photo opportunity. They're not a place to pose or to play balance beams to put on your social media account. Now, recently I've become interested in when dark tourism began. And one of the things that I want to try and kind of answer today is when Ripper dark tourism began and how it began and when it began. This is kind of a story of a research tangent that grew out of my study of a very little known late Victorian crime novel which shows the public engaging in dark tourism at the site of a murder in 1891. So I'll show you here. This is the novel, and the author, Israel Zangwill. Excellent hair, excellent glasses, and excellent novel, The Big Bow Mystery. Highly recommend it. Zangwill probably is best known for his portraits of London's East End in the novel Children of the Ghetto from 1892, a novel that earned him the title The Jewish Dickens. But he wrote many things aside from that and worked also for the newspaper The Star. He came from a desperately poor family in Whitechapel. He was the eldest son of 5 children. His father was a Russian refugee from the 1840s who made a very precarious living as a trader in second-hand clothes. Zangwill was an exceptional scholar who graduated with triple honours from London University before beginning his working life as a schoolteacher. But he soon moved on to become a man of letters, specialising really as a satirist and humorist, and then, as I said, making a solid reputation with that novel, Children of the Ghetto. The Big Bow Mystery, though, is worth a look as well. Has an interesting publication history. It was first published in serial form in London's only politically radical daily newspaper, The Star, in the summer of 1891, over a 2-week period from the 22nd of August to the 4th of September. Zangwill had been appointed The Star's literary columnist, and he soon developed a reputation for his very witty, politically charged reviewing style. So in the summer of 1891, the editor of The Star at that time, Ernest Park, contacted Zangwill and requested something for, quote, the silly season, which is the kind of August period when not much is happening in the news. He wanted a piece of fiction that would capture and reflect readers' interest in crime, in politics, and in the East End. So, with murder in my soul, Zangwill later joked, the Big Bow Mystery was hastily written in a fortnight, day by day, reaching upwards of 250,000 readers during its serialisation. Yet, if its construction is formulaic, and it certainly is, it's essentially a variation of a very classic locked room mystery formula of the type pioneered by Edgar Allan Poe 50 years earlier with The Murders in the Rue Morgue. Its settings and its characters certainly aren't run-of-the-mill. As the title implies, the Big Bow Mystery takes place in London's Bow, which is just a stone's throw from Whitechapel, the site of the yet still unsolved Ripper murders. Zangwill chose Bow pointedly, I think, not only because of the Ripper murders, but because this was a neighbourhood which was rife with contemporary political and social meanings. So this is Bow on the Charles Booth poverty maps online. Bow is almost adjacent to Whitechapel, the site of the Ripper murders, obviously. And on the Booth poverty maps, you can see here that it's identified something similar in terms of class to Whitechapel, in that it's marked in the red of the middle classes along the main roads where there would have been shops and so on. But once you get into the kind of housing areas, it's then coloured in the blue and dark blue and sometimes black, which denotes the poor, the very poor, and in Booth's terms, the vicious and semi-criminal classes. Although it's not very far from the city and the prosperous West End, late Victorian Bow was figuratively 1,000,000 miles away from what Franco Moretti has noted are the fancy hotels, mansions overlooking the park, and great banks which form the geographical epicentre of the most famous late Victorian detective stories, the Sherlock Holmes stories. Instead, this area houses a large number of factories, including the Bryant and May matchworks, which would become famous for the Match Girl strike. There's a number of flour mills, breweries and gasworks. There's the Great Eastern Railway, and there's also the People's Palace, the philanthropically funded centre of culture for the lower classes. Here we go, I have a picture of it here and some of the committee who helped to set it up. In neighbouring Bethnal Green and Mile End stood the philanthropic settlements Oxford House and Toynbee Hall, from which idealistic university graduates sought to bring friendship, education and enlightenment to the local poor. Given the district's poverty, though, and its large immigrant population, it's not surprising that in the 1880s and 1890s, East London became known as an area of growing class agitation and socialist activity. Bow, in particular, as I said, was famously the site of the Match Girls strike of July 1888 at Bryant and May, organised by the prominent social reformer Annie Besant and the star writer George Bernard Shaw, amongst others. This successful strike then, in turn, encouraged the growth of new unionism among workers at the Port of London, leading to the famous dock strikes of August 1889 and the first attempt to organise unskilled women workers into a trade union. Bow would also later become the location for the East London Federation of Suffragettes, formed in 1913 by Sylvia Pankhurst after her break from the Women's Social and Political Union. So an atmosphere of socialism and radicalism in local politics is as much a part of this book's atmosphere as the ubiquitous mist and fog that shroud Bow's main streets. Let's move on then to thinking a little bit more about the Star newspaper in which this novel by Zangwill was first published. T.P. O'Connor, pictured here, was an Irish journalist, MP, editor, representative of the Home Rule League, and he had founded the Star newspaper in January 1888, specifically as a paper for the poor and for working class East End residents, many of whom, as I said, were immigrants, many of whom were Irish. And it was to be what he called a radical evening organ for the metropolis. In his editorial column for the first edition, O'Connor promised that the paper was to be for the charwoman who lives in St Giles, the seamstress who is sweated in Whitechapel, the labourer who stands begging for work outside the dockyard gates in St George's in the East. So it was a paper for the East End, for the working class poor, and as a result it covered topics of interest to those readers. There were editorials in support of home rule, labour laws, and there was often critique of police brutality and inefficiency at protecting the poor. The Whitechapel Ripper murders were predictably an early example of the Star's more sensational coverage, and coverage of the Ripper narratives continued well into the 1890s. The paper became particularly notorious for its lurid coverage of the Whitechapel murders in the summer of 1888, where it really indicted the police for failing to catch the Ripper, reading this as a failing to look after the interests of London's poor. So, for example, on October the 1st, with the culprit still at large, the paper's front page exclaimed, "The police, of course, are helpless. We expect nothing of them. The metropolitan force is rotten to the core." And again, this is something that I could speak more about, the kind of reputation of the police, particularly among the working classes in the 1870s and 1880s, was low. And this fed into certain types of crime writing and crime reportage particularly. By the end of its first year of operation, the Star had reached a circulation of 50,000. It ran to 5 editions daily and could confidently declare itself a phenomenal success. The Big Bow mystery then was positioned ideologically in the teeth of this winning formula. Along with brutal political critique, the Star, as I said, often had lurid and sensational coverage of the Ripper's crimes. For instance, after the body of the second Ripper victim was found, the Times, the paper of record, reported quite mildly on, quote, "another murder in Whitechapel." The Star, by contrast, led with this rather more unrestrained multiple headline that you can see here: "A revolting murder, another woman found horribly mutilated in Whitechapel, ghastly crimes by a maniac," with the very visceral subhead: "A policeman discovers a woman lying in the gutter with her throat cut. After she has been removed to the hospital, she is found to be disemboweled." It's incredibly lurid, but this type of coverage did nothing to deter readers. Quite the opposite, in fact. During this coverage, the paper's circulation soared to around about 300,000 copies daily. The Big Bow mystery, which, as I said, was serialised in this paper in lots of ways, is quite a lightweight locked room mystery, but it's also a very pointed satirical examination of the intersection between London's public, its press, and its print culture in the consumption of narratives of crime. In particular, it's a fantastic satire of the press coverage of the Ripper murders. In the story, Zangwill critiques the role of the press in inciting hysteria, basically, over the crime, and its part in inciting and encouraging what I'm saying is dark tourism. What's interesting and surprising about this to me, or at least it has been while I've been researching it, is this seems like a pretty daring thing to publish in the Star itself, the paper that had actually really ruthlessly exploited the Whitechapel murders as an editorial topic and as a driver for sales. Just to give you a very brief plot synopsis then, the novel tells the story of the murder of a middle-class philanthropist who is slumming in Bow. He has the excellent name Arthur Constant, and he's an Oxford graduate who is discovered dead in his bed in a Bow boarding house. He has been there working at the People's Palace in Mile End Road. Um, the People's Palace, which I mentioned to you earlier, had opened its doors on October 3rd, 1887, with Queen Victoria in attendance, and was funded by philanthropists. It was a multi-purpose centre which brightened the lives, in its PR speak, of locals by providing space for exhibitions, lectures, concerts, plays and physical exercise. In neighbouring Bethnal Green and Mile End stood the philanthropic settlements Oxford House and Toynbee Hall, from which idealistic male university graduates like Arthur Constant sought to bring enlightenment to the poor. Constant's landlady, also with a fantastic name, Mrs. Drabdump, discovers the body while in the company of her neighbour, the retired police detective George Grodman. Interesting, his name as well. I mean, you can see, I think, why Zangwill is called the Dickens of the ghetto, with these kind of comic names. George Grodman doesn't maybe strike you as anything that interesting at first, but when you look into it, Grodman actually is Yiddish for good man, and that becomes deeply ironic when you find out that he is in fact not a very good man at all. So Mrs. Drabdump and Grodman break down the door and discover the body of Arthur with his throat cut. And the subsequent list of suspects is a kind of coterie of East End working class residents, including a leading trade unionist, that's who the police favour for the crime, the landlady herself and a hack journalist. And in a pleasingly kind of self-referential and mocking touch, Zangwill has the Star newspaper jumping to the erroneous conclusion by assuming that this is a suicide rather than a murder. Now, the surprising denouement reveals that, spoiler alert, please close your ears now for a second if you don't want to learn this, the murderer was in fact the retired police officer Grodman, who was also the novel's main detective. This is a playful flourish, of course, but it's more than an artful joke here. For as the mystery unfolds, it becomes increasingly clear that the press is not so much an ingredient in this story, but in fact supplies the medium or the frame within which the entire story is implotted, since it turns out that the motivation behind the crime is intricately bound up with print culture. Basically, the person who committed the crime was motivated by a desire for notoriety in print. He hoped that he would commit the perfect crime, a locked room mystery that would garner a lot of press attention and would provide an excellent appendix to a memoir of his time in the police called Criminals I Have Caught. Throughout the novel, Zangwill is constantly foregrounding the relationship between crime and the press. He embeds newspaper reports and letters to the press into the text. He reports that, quote, within a few hours the jubilant newsboys were shrieking about the murder, and the leader writers revelled in recapitulating the circumstances of the Big Bow mystery. The Star itself is identified as the first paper to break the details of the crime. So Zangwill's Big Bow murder then isn't simply a crime, but it's what Judith Wolkowitz, when she was referring to the Ripper murders, has called a full-scale media event. And bolstering this rendering of the Big Bow murder as a kind of fully fledged media spectacle, Zangwill describes how the site, the place of Constant's murder, number 11 Gower Street, Bow, becomes what he calls a shrine of pilgrimage for the newspaper reading public. Consumers of the newspaper story about the crime come from all over London to observe the murder site. From all parts of town, people came to stare up at the bedroom window and wonder with a foolish face of horror. The pavement was often blocked for hours together, and itinerant vendors of refreshment made it a new market centre, while vocalists hastened thither to sing the delectable ditty of the deed without having any voice in the matter. And it was this passage, this scene, that got me thinking about the concept of dark tourism as a late Victorian spectacle of crime. So I knew obviously that there were loads of modern tours to see the Jack the Ripper's crime sites, but I was surprised to find that tours and kind of gatherings at sites of murder were being satirised as early as 1891. So I started to look at Victorian newspapers, studies of crime, studies of dark tourism, to see if I could trace the history of this practice in relationship to the Ripper. I should say that Victorian Ripper tours are mentioned in scholarship on dark tourism, but in very scanty detail. So you'll get people saying, yes, there definitely were tours, quite soon after the murders, but we don't really get much evidence of how they know that or where that comes from. And you'll get, for example, anecdotes about Arthur Conan Doyle going with the police surgeon on a tour of the Ripper sites in the late 1890s. But there's no concrete detail really out there in the scholarship that I'm aware of that tells us when Ripper tours decisively started. And it's my belief, it's my contention that Ripper tours are a form of urban spectacle that emerged out of the appetite for gory details of crime, which were engendered in the newspaper reading public by the consumption of that very visceral type of tabloid crime journalism that we find in papers like The Star and in other papers such as the Illustrated London News, which I'm going to talk a little bit about later on. The 1828 Red Barn murders are a particularly good early example, I think, of this imbrication of crime, the press, and the ways that 19th century crime was actually consumed and learned about, leading to the creation of a kind of multimedia, cross-class, dark touristic spectacle. In April of 1828, the body of Maria Martin was discovered buried under the floor of the Red Barn, which is quite a famous local landmark in Surrey. She had been killed and buried by William Corder, her erstwhile lover. In July that year, so only a few months after the discovery of her body, a full-scale dark tourism industry was already in operation, centering on the site of the Red Barn, the location of the murder and the burial. The editor of the Examiner wrote, as you see on the slide here, the landlord upon whose premises a murder has been committed is nowadays a made man. The place becomes a show, the neighbourhood the scene of a fair. The barn in which Maria Martin was murdered by Corder was sold in toothpicks. Really, if people indulge in this vile and horrid taste, they will tempt landlords to get murders committed in their houses from the great profit accruing from morbid curiosity. Obviously written with tongue firmly in cheek there, but the boards of the Red Barn were indeed stripped and sold as toothpicks to dark tourists. For those unable to travel to the location or to procure a piece of the barn, the murder narrative could be consumed via the Newgate calendar shown here on the slide, complete with detailed illustrations. And there was even something you may have seen before, Staffordshire pottery of the Red Barn. There's a few different versions of this. Some of them you'll see Maria Martin and her murderer both depicted in. These are obviously for the much more affluent murderabilia aficionado. So I want to skip forward now to the 1880s and back to the Whitechapel Ripper murders. Um, on the 7th of August 1888, Martha Tabrum was found murdered just off Whitechapel High Street. When Polly Nichols was then found dead on the 31st of August, the possibility that this was a serial murderer, although of course that terminology would not have been used then, began to take hold, and the press especially began to feel that this could potentially be a big story. So as I said earlier, while the Times would reported on these crimes in a fairly sober manner, the murders were a godsend to the more lurid papers like the Star and the Illustrated Police News. Now, the Illustrated Police News, for anyone who knows or has access to it, is a one-penny weekly newspaper which specialised in graphic illustrated stories about lurid true crimes and courtroom dramas. And, you know, the stories they covered sort of go from the vaguely sensible to the absolutely crazy. These are some of my favourite of the more kind of crazy end of the spectacle here. The duel between nuns, a man being eaten by his cats. Don't believe it, cats would never do that. A mad mother throwing her child out the window, and the alarming experience of some bathers who are attacked by an octopus who looks alarmingly like E.T., I've always thought. So these are kind of some of the silly stories that the Illustrated London News picked up on and illustrated on its front covers. And, you know, you could go down this rabbit hole of looking through the ILN for weeks on end. It's so funny and so fascinating. But when you look at how it depicts or depicted the Ripper murders, you start to get a sense of why it was so popular, I think. I mean, one of the things that undoubtedly was attracting readers to this paper were the detailed and often very graphic illustrations of crimes. I mean, I think they also harken back to Newgate calendars, in that quite often you'll have a very visceral illustration right on the front cover of somebody swinging an axe at someone's head and someone else with blood spurting out of them. You know, the very active and very disturbing scenes of crime would sometimes be depicted. Its editor explained, if a tragedy were to occur in London today, we would send an artist straight away to the scene. The artist, of course, always endeavours to get a view of the scene of the tragedy, outrage, suicide or accident, and we always give a picture of the house in which the inquest is held. Now, like the Star, the paper became particularly well known for its coverage of the Whitechapel Ripper murders, and its circulation peaked at around 600,000 copies per week, with the Ripper story featuring on a quite astonishing 184 covers in the 4 years after the final murder. That statistic comes from the Dictionary of Journalism, which I don't have here to show you, but you know what I mean. Break and demur. And what I want to do here is show you a few of the illustrations relating to the Ripper murders, just to give you a sense of how lurid and how graphic the images were, and the ways in which these images emphasise both the bodies of the women, but also the sites and places of the crime. So just as a kind of content note, these are kind of disturbing black and white illustrations, but I'm not going to show any photographs or any real depictions of the victims. So what we have here is the second victim, Martha Tabrum, being discovered in George's Yard, just off the Whitechapel Road. You'll see here it shows her body. It also shows a couple of scenes of George's Yard, and down at the bottom right here, there's also an illustration of the victim's corset stabbed through. So they're really, emphasizing both the location but also the nature of her injuries. Move on then to the third victim. She's sketched after her murder and actually in her coffin with the nature of her injuries shown. And once again, the location of her murder spelled out here, down at the bottom left corner, finding the body in Bucks Row. This is the front cover of the Illustrated London News after the fourth victim was found, Annie Chapman. And here the police news was paying special attention to the locations of the crime, showing the house where the victim was last seen, 29 Hanbury Street. Oh, sorry, not that's where the crime was committed, 29 Hanbury Street, and the house where she was last seen is a public house, the Bell here, which is shown on the right. And then again, we have the image of the fifth victim, again emphasizing the body, the blood, and the space where it occurred. Same with the sixth victim, which is particularly kind of visceral, I think. And the seventh victim then, which really emphasizes place more than bodily injuries in this case. But you can see in general how salacious these images are. This is something that Perry Curtis has noted in his wonderful study of the Jack the Ripper murders in the London press. He says, when it came to bloodshed, Victorian readers seemed to relish the details of what knives, axes, bullets or other lethal weapons had done to the victims' bodies. Many of the morbid details revealed in the press would be deemed unfit to print today, even in the most Murdochian tabloids. Descriptions of bodies, stabbed, shot, poisoned and dismembered, what I call sensation horror news, compose the centerpieces of feature stories about the inquests and trials in homicide cases. Thus, a good deal of Victorian murder news qualifies as gornography, because the clinical or anatomical details published offer a fine feast for the eyes of more prurient readers. Now, Curtis doesn't actually really go into much detail about illustrated newspapers. And that's again something that I could talk about a little bit more. Illustrated newspapers obviously have a particular target audience of readers who are perhaps not fully literate but can still understand pictures and illustrations of events. So it will appeal to the kind of poorest classes and the least educated. And I also think that the illustrations in the Illustrated London News or the Illustrated Police News seem to be an extreme example of the kind of gornography that Perry Curtis mentions here, but also they seem to be really interested in space and place. And because of that, I would argue that the consumption of these images of the crimes is a kind of vicarious dark tourism. It's taking you to the location of the crime. And certainly the appetite for consumption of the Ripper's crimes seemed to coalesce around place, and therefore seems to have encouraged a canny few to capitalise upon access to viewing the murder scenes much in the same way as was done with the Red Barn. So on the 8th of September, the day of Annie Chapman's murder, the Star reported on the practice of paying to view the scene. For several hours past, the occupants of the adjoining house have been charging an admission fee of 1 penny to people anxious to view the spot where the body was found, Several hundreds of people have availed themselves of this opportunity, though all that can be seen are a couple of packing cases, from beneath which is the stain of a blood track. And this is an image here from the Illustrated Police News, which, actually directs you to the bloodstains, Hanbury Street. It's labelled as such. Some papers also use their reportage about this dark tourism, which seems to have been almost taken for granted as something that would happen as a natural consequence of the murder. But they used it as an opportunity to comment on the morbid tastes of the poor, and to criticise the poor. The East London Advertiser, for instance, says, with all our boasted civilisation and the increase of educational facilities, the morbid tastes of the poor still come to the front, or we should not hear of hundreds of persons paying a penny each to view the backyard of the house in Hanbury Street, where the poor unfortunate woman Annie Chapman was hacked to pieces. The police, it is true, stopped the exhibition, but not before a considerable sum had been netted by those in charge of the house. But a week later, a number of papers, including the Times, were still reporting large crowds gathering at Hanbury Street and paying a penny to view the woman's murder site. The Penny Illustrated paper reported that during the whole of last Saturday and Sunday, a large crowd congregated, as delineated in our front engraving, that's the one shown here, in front of the house in Hanbury Street, and the neighbours on either side did much business by making a small charge to persons who were willing to pay it to view from windows the yard in which the murder was committed. And you have to wonder, I think, here about the kind of reciprocal relationship between the continued reporting of this type of activity and its continued popularity. I mean, I wonder, did it being reported continue to encourage people to go there who perhaps wouldn't have thought of doing so beforehand? And then just before I'm coming up to closing here, I want to mention how just a few weeks later, the East End novelist Margaret Harkness wrote to the Pall Mall Gazette under her usual pseudonym John Law to describe that a very distasteful Ripper waxwork museum, not unlike the Ripper Museum that I was talking about earlier, had sprung up right on the Whitechapel Road. She said, there is at present, almost opposite the London Hospital, a ghastly display which brings the exhibitors a good living. Outside it is a picture of the unfortunate women murdered by what the slummers call that bloody demon. Inside it is a cellar full of horrors. At the further end of the place, a scene of carnage, men and women murdering and being murdered. An old man exhibits these things, and while he points them out, you will be tightly wedged in between a number of boys and girls, while a smell of death rises into your nostrils, and you feel as if your throat were filled up with some poisonous fungus. In Zangwill's novel, with its scene of pilgrimage to Gower Street in Bow, and the crowds of blank faces that were staring in the murder site, the author is clearly satirising the prurient practice of dark tourism, reported and seemingly encouraged by papers such as The Star, which he worked for in the wake of the Ripper murders. To me, it seemed surprising that Ripper tourism sprang up so soon after those murders, but less so when we think about the appetite for violent crime, which was already present in the Victorian reading public because of the types of newspapers they consumed. Zangwill's representation of dark tourism is just one way by which the author draws attention to the role of the press in creating and sustaining an appetite for the gory spectacle of crime. I want to close just by suggesting that by engaging in such audacious criticism in the pages of one of the papers that most employed reportage as a strategy to attract readers. Sangwill's novel helps us to think about and to unpack some of the intricacies and contradictions in the relationship between crime, policing, publicity, and the press in late Victorian Britain. I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for listening. Here are my contact details, and I look forward to chatting to you all next week. Bye.